So hi, everyone. Welcome to this Center for Biomedical Ethics webinar, the first in the series of 4 webinars, lunchtime webinars, I guess, on research ethics. So by way of introduction, my name is Owen Schaefer. I'm with the Center for Biomedical Ethics. I'm an assistant professor. I work on a variety of areas in research ethics, including areas related to public interests, consent waivers, and various issues, particularly stemming from the regulatory apparatus that was established in Singapore for biomedical research several years ago. So the format for today's event, we have the hour for this session. I'll give a talk for about 20 minutes, sort of introducing just this question of today's session: what is research? And give some basic guidance from MOH particularly that I think is useful, although it will leave a lot of area open for interpretation. And so the second talk will be by Dr. Jerry Menikoff, who I'll introduce in a minute, who will go through some very interesting cases to apply this question and show how it can be differentially understood and the implications of different understandings of what is research and what follows from or what doesn't follow from classifying something as a research activity versus another kind of activity like a clinical practice or a quality assurance exercise. And then we'll have time after those 2 talks, remaining time for Q&A. Q&A will be done, it'll be mostly informal in this session. So we have the chat function. You can enter in questions there. And as we go along, you can feel free to enter in questions as they come up, and we'll return to them after the 2 talks. And then or if you prefer, you can put your hand up and use your camera and microphone. Either one are fine for the Q&A portion. This is, as you'll have seen, I think, from our mailers, this is, again, the first of 4 sessions. If you registered for this early on, we have subsequently opened up registration for the other 3 sessions. They're spread 2 weeks apart, same time, Wednesdays 12 to 1, same format. We'll rotate the speakers between not just Jerry and myself. We'll also have Professor Julian Savulescu and Dr. Sumitra Menon giving some of the other talks later on in the series. And this is, of course, not the only offering from CBME in relation to research ethics, but we're hoping to highlight a few core topics for this series, and we'll be sure to promulgate future information about other events that we run to those who are attending this event. I think those are all the preliminaries. I'm not forgetting anything. So I'll begin with the session. So before I give my talk, I'll just introduce Jerry, who will give the second talk. So Professor Jerry Menikoff, he's a professor of bioethics at the Center for Biomedical Ethics here at NUS. We're very fortunate for him to have joined our faculty this year. He is trained as an attorney and a physician, and that's a wonderful combination for doing bioethical work. So prior to NUS, and for 14 years, he held a very important post at the U.S. National Institutes of Health. He was director of the Office for Human Research Protections there, and the insights he gained in that period and from his work prior to that, I think, are just really invaluable for us here in Singapore and beyond. So I'm really looking forward to what he can shed light on for us in the cases he's encountered. He also has written a couple of books, for those that are interested, that are highly relevant to many of the issues we'll discuss today. One of them is Law and Bioethics Introduction. The other is What the Doctor Didn't Say: The Hidden Truth About Medical Research. Okay, but we'll start off with my brief introduction. I'll try to keep to roughly 20 minutes, so we have much time for Jerry's talk and then the Q&A at the end. So I'll be kind of self-sharing. Let me just get a timer going for myself. For my slides. Yeah. Okay, I think the sharing should be working. If there's any technical difficulties as I'm going along, I'll try to keep an eye on the chat, or if I'm not kind of responding to the chat, actually I see there's my chat button is obscured by my camera. You can put a flag up, and I'll try to address it if there's some audio issue or otherwise. But okay, let me get started. Okay. So what is research? The topic of today's webinar. It's in some ways a simple question, the simple definition. Human Biomedical Research Act has a definition in black and white that we can use, and I'll use this as a sort of touchstone throughout my talk. And I think, well, why do we need an hour? We've got a definition right here. And it is very useful, but there'll be a lot of complications in interpreting it that we'll go through today. But according to the HBRA, In Singapore, any research study is any systematic investigation with the intention of developing or contributing to generalizable knowledge. This is Singapore law, but it is very, very similar to definitions you'll find for research around the world. Look at the US Common Rule, the Australian National Statement, as well as the international level, the World Health Organization's SIOM's guidelines, very similar definitions. This intent knowledge based knowledge generation based definition. Just a note about scope. This definition is broad, includes all sorts of research, but a lot of the discussion in today's session is focused on particular types of research. We're looking at human subjects research, that is studies involving engaging or interacting with human beings, or if not directly, making use of identifiable data or samples. We're also looking at biomedical setting in Singapore. Of course, there's many non-biomedical research applications, but a lot of the principles we talk about should apply to those non-biomedical settings as well. But because in Singapore these are directly regulated, the biomedical research is directly regulated, unlike non-biomedical research. I'll be working off of this context. In Q&A, we can discuss further if people prefer social behavioral applications, but I think the general principles should apply. Also, I know some percentage, 10 or so people that registered were from outside Singapore. This will make reference frequently, at least during my talk, to Singaporean standards. But again, the principles should be applicable in other jurisdictions. And Jerry's talk will also be relating to some cases from outside of Singapore. So again, should apply elsewhere as well. Okay, so there's the definition. Why does it really matter? Just figuring out something is research or not. It's kind of an interesting theoretical question. But there is a crucial difference when you classify, or several crucial differences when you classify something as research. And the reason that this matters, well, there's two explanations, at least two that I'll summarize. The first is the ethical reason, right? This matters morally speaking, because when you engage in research, right, you're making use of somebody not for their primarily own benefit, though we can talk later about how we might still hope for the benefiting of the research participants, but the primary purpose is this knowledge generation. Okay, so there's a sense in which, going back to philosophers like Immanuel Kant, research involves treating someone as a means rather than an end. And are generally called Kantian frameworks to treat people as ends in themselves. And so the research approach, has this immediate kind of tension with that sort of notion of respect. Doesn't mean it's impermissible or anything like that, but just that we might need to be careful in how we conduct this research compared to other sorts of activities. So this does give rise to particular risks that might come from this drive for knowledge generation in the name of generating valuable knowledge and valuable scientific insights and medically beneficial innovations. Risk of exploiting individuals, that is taking advantage of unfair power dynamics, particularly in the clinical setting, but also potentially other settings. There's always this issue of risk-benefit assessment, huge part, and we'll have the next webinar session will be on risk assessment and risks in research. And of course, the possibility, especially when benefit is not the primary aim of the research study, of having risks that outweigh a benefit is a serious concern in research ethics. And another major pillar of research ethics is the idea of informed consent. Informed consent, of course, being a pillar of research. There are exceptions to informed consent requirements, but nevertheless, it's a default. And we don't actually, none of the 4 webinar series of these 4 sessions is actually on informed consent specifically, but we may return to it in future CBME learning activities. So in light of these special concerns, these special issues of potential exploitation, risks, and consent, the idea is there's special protections needed, right, to primarily look after participants, but also nevertheless ensure that valuable research, valuable knowledge can still go through while protecting those subjects. Okay, but in addition to the ethical argument, well, I would think and I hope to some extent the ethical reasoning underpins the regulations that we're bound by legally and also institutionally based on certain policies of universities or other institutes we might work for. And so these ethical concerns and also various scandals that won't go through today, but various scandals in sort of the history of research ethics have led to a series of relatively stringent regulations of certain forms of research, particularly biomedical research and clinical trials, right? That's where, at least in Singapore and many other jurisdictions, regulations are tightest, probably because that's where the risks are most substantial, right? In social behavioral research, well, there might be issues of consent and kind of deception and that sort of thing. the risks are usually lower, and so there's less of an impetus for kind of national regulation or guideline in those sorts of settings. So we have in Singapore the Human Biomedical Research Act and Health Products Clinical Trials Regulations, which are the two main regulatory apparatuses that govern human subjects research in Singapore. There's also the Medicines Clinical Trials Regulations. They cover a much smaller subset of research, but the most clinical trials are under health products regulations, and things outside of that mostly fall under human biomedical research. So research on surgical techniques, research using human biomedical data, or other non-pharmaceutical interventions, often under HPRA. The regulations are similar. We won't go into too much detail about regulations today, except to highlight the scope of those of both of those regulations. It does relate to research. So sort of, again, why does it matter? Well, if something counts as human biomedical research, it will meet there will be triggering all of these different regulatory requirements, and that includes requirements for IRB approval. That's institutional review boards. Many of you are involved yourselves in IRBs, so you'll be well aware of this, and that comes with additional institutional oversight. Research institutions have certain responsibilities to ensure proper conduct of research, and indeed the IRBs are answerable to the research institutions to ensure that the research is conducted properly and in accordance with regulations. There are specific consent provisions, informed consent provisions. That is, the law delineates specific pieces of information that need to be in consent forms if you're part of a research trial. Whereas in, say, clinical practice, consent processes are not so regulated, not so definitively regulated from the top down. There might be professional guidelines for consent, but not something that contained in legislation. Whereas HPRA has in legislation a series of consent requirements. There are specific protections for vulnerable populations, particularly populations who might be limited ability to consent for themselves, so adults lacking capacity or children. And other populations have specific protections and certain standards relating to risk and consent. And there's also certain adherency requirements for protocol deviations. Notably, on the latter point in Singapore, violations, particularly of the HPRA, is legally enforceable. That is, there are criminal penalties if you deviate from a protocol in a way that has not been approved by an IRB and so forth. That might sound scary to some folks, but to attenuate that, this is sort of the regulatory approach in Singapore to generally have criminally enforceable statutes, but that doesn't mean that researchers are being thrown in jail left and right whenever they fail to when they forget to take a blood draw, or even when they have a consent form that's deficient in some way. There's never been in Singapore to date a prosecution under the Human Biomedical Research Act, nor an exercise of prosecutorial powers under the Health Products Clinical Trials Act. So these are enforceable, but that's more of a kind of a signal for their seriousness. The actual enforcement mechanisms are through institutions, rejecting certain studies, institutions, putting certain researchers on notice, putting them up for review, and potentially restricting their research activities. So it is primarily self-regulated in practice, but if institutions are failing, MOH has the legal authority to step in. Okay, so given that sort of regulation and ethics of what's at stake, we can then explore more about how we can differentiate research activities from non-research activities. And that definition that I put forward earlier, it's a simple definition with two key components. All right, so the first component, and both of these are necessary components for something to count as research, is the intent, right? And this is the purpose, that's to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. Okay, that's the aim and the raison d'etre. And that aim, which is again not primarily for the benefit of participants, is what gives rise to many of the ethical challenges. But it's not just about intent, there's also an issue with methodology. There needs to be systematic investigation. That is, the intent is carried out not just through means that are in some ways ad hoc or unsystematic, but there's some specific methodology that's being utilized. So with intent, sometimes, though not in the Singaporean regulatory definition, but sometimes it's framed as primary intent, being to generate knowledge, and that's important because the intent to generate knowledge is compatible with other goals as well, particularly in clinical research. But those other goals are not the reason you conduct the study in the first place. They're goals that you might hope to achieve inter alia, but the reason you're doing the study is to generate the knowledge. And that's contrasted with healthcare, general healthcare, I should say, where the primary aim is to benefit the patient. Again, there might be other considerations in the healthcare setting, but that's the best interest standard of the patient is what's dominant. And indeed, in clinical research, the need of physicians to abide by their obligations towards patients while also conducting research to contribute to generalizable knowledge is the source of many clinical research ethics dilemmas. We can also contrast this with quality improvement or quality assurance. In those instances, while there is a sense of generating knowledge or generating information, it's internal, right? It's for internal service improvement, internal quality improvement, internal to the institute or organization that is conducting the research. It's not being promulgated more widely. It's kind of interesting why these rules don't apply to QI and QA. There still does as much risk, you might say, of exploitation, of excessive risk, etc. But yeah, this is the scope anyway that's been kind of developed around the definition of research. So internal QI, QA procedures don't really attract the same regulatory scrutiny. On methodology, systematic investigation covers a large range of methodologies. There's no specific definition, certainly not regulatorily. They'll have some guidance I'll walk through in a second that gets into more details on methodologies. So this includes randomized controlled trials, the gold standard, so to speak, in clinical research. But it also includes, many other different forms of research. Single-arm studies, observational studies, prospective or retrospective data analysis, as long as it's using identifiable data, can count there. So what does this even exclude since it's so broad? Well, it seems to include things like simple case studies. After a doctor sees a patient, sometimes they will write up a description of the case for edification of peers, ideally with the agreement of the patient, ideally anonymized, but often that is not considered research because it's not systematic. It's just kind of a one-off reflection. Maybe people will learn from it, but maybe it is generalizable, but it's not a systematic investigation. Okay, so that's a broad-based distinction, but Ministry of Health has helpfully produced a much more detailed guidance document. At the end of the slides, I'll go through the references or the links, and we can send those out later as well. This is freely available online from the Ministry of Health. It's adapted from the United Kingdom's Medical Research Council, I believe, and it goes through each of these categories. This is the first of, I think, 4 or 5 pages I have here. So the first goes on the intent component, right? That's really big. And again, research developing not generalizable knowledge systematically, right? So you look at service evaluation. You might still be generating knowledge, but that's a secondary purpose. The main purpose is, again, improvement of service delivery rather than knowledge itself. Similar for clinical audit. Surveillance, that column here is, I think, referring to disease surveillance. Infectious Diseases Act governs kind of infectious diseases activities separately from HPRA and others. Actually, there is a way to evade HPRA if you do certain government-commissioned infectious disease studies, but I won't get into those details today. But yeah, with surveillance, the idea there is not, again, to generate generalizable knowledge per se, but information that can be utilized directly for promoting public health and using public health interventions. And so if there's going to be a subsequent publication of data from internal surveillance studies, that could be done. Typically, you'd want, when you're doing that subsequent research, to get some level of IRB review for that subsequent publications. Similarly for outbreak investigations. Okay, then we also can look at the focus of the study. With research, this isn't really definitional. This is sort of the indicators, right? It's not that all research will actually contain every single thing in the research column, but this is typical of what MOH would consider research. So with research activities, usually the information derived from the subject itself is what we're looking at, what we're investigating, right? What tests are related to. Look at service evaluation instead, it's more institutional, or it's not really so much about individuals and individual outcomes, but about systems capabilities, about processes that are in place, and how processes might or might not affect kind of these broad-based outcomes. And then similarly with surveillance, well, yes, you are actually looking at human subjects. That's actually a similarity with research compared to clinical audit or quality improvement. So yeah, you have to look at other distinctions, just focus on the studies to distinguish surveillance activities from research activities. We can look at the design. This gets to methodology. There's a few other lines also on different methodologies. So you can have quantitative or qualitative methods, as we discussed many different methods. But usually, one thing that chart clarifies, usually does not involve treatment methods that are already generally accepted. This is a little bit of tricky. I'm not certain, actually, I fully agree with MOH on this, because you can certainly do research that is testing between different modes of standard of care, actually. That is a form of research. I can't remember if Jerry has a case on this. It has sometimes attracted controversy, but comparing two different forms of standard of care can absolutely fall under research. So this is again kind of sort of typically what is sort of typical of research, but shouldn't take it as a strict definition. Still, we can contrast that with things like service or clinical audit, where again the design is done differently, not about necessarily testing out a certain treatment, but looking at things like cost effectiveness, things about alignment with industry or clinical standards, and whether or not that standard that is predetermined is being met. And similarly for surveillance, the intervention, the design is geared towards a public health outcome, a direct public health outcome, not really so much the knowledge outcome, though that's kind of an intermediary necessary step to generate the knowledge, but it is going to be assessed based on mitigating the public health risks, improving the public health outcomes in the area of study. Okay, other kind of indicators, though again not definitional research, may or may not have existing evidence, but again with service evaluation, clinical audits, usually there'll be some existing standards they're applying, and again with surveillance work and infectious diseases work, there's again usually prior frameworks for epidemiology. Not to say there aren't any prior evidence bases in research, but they're more broad-based and not as specific, delineating sort of the standards by which you're going to be upholding. Again, we talked about benefits to the subject, may or may not be benefiting subjects directly in research, but the other categories are expected and derived to benefit, if not individuals, then to benefit the systems that individuals are involved in. There's also very different levels of responsibilities. So there's lists there on this table that relate to the sort of legal and professional obligations within the research team, which are fairly stringent. This illustrates that. But the responsibilities are much more limited when you look at systems evaluation, service evaluation, right? So there are requirements for essentially data privacy, data security that need to be abided by. But because typically these service evaluations are non-interventional, and even when they involve data, the data will often be non-sensitive. There's a much more limited degree of responsibility there. And similar concern, the table has them as blank, but similar data levels of data security and data concern will apply in surveillance and outbreak investigation. In the areas of data research, though, where we're just doing pure retrospective data analysis, but still on human subjects, and that's still counting as research. In this area, the responsibilities will be similar, but again, there are many regulatory requirements that research triggers that other activities would not. So you still need IRB approval, or if not approval, then exemption from approval based on the institutional requirements for those categories. There's other aspects like sharing. So generalizable knowledge, how is it generalizable? One signal is, are you going to publish the results? Again, not required for definition, but a big signal, this is research if you're planning to publish it. Sometimes things like surveillance results can be published. That's a little bit of a gray area in my view. But usually that's not, again, the primary purpose of what you're doing. It might be something you do after the fact. And if you do it after the fact, it's generally a good idea to get some level of institutional or IRB approval for that. Journals often require this. Though again, under Infectious Diseases Act, there are avenues that sort of work around those requirements. There have been publications that using identifiable data that did not have IRB approval because under regulations that's permissible in Singapore for very specific sorts of infectious diseases studies. We also talked a bit about approach, relates to, again, the sort of methodologies being used in research, a little more systematic than other areas. And finally, one of the reasons why, again, we have this higher standard for research compared to these other activities is the risk level, right? Primarily for interventional research, because the other four categories here, actually, they're typically not interventional, right? These are actually, the other categories are primarily data-based. Information-based investigations, and that just has a much more limited scope of risks compared to interventional research. Of course, again, for actual pure data research using identifiable data, these additional risks will actually be relatively similar. So you can't use it as a firm distinction, but it is a sort of general categorical fact of research that typically, or maybe in general, it has these risks that require extra oversight for end review. Okay, so what are the upshots of these? I think I have about a minute left on my own time to summarize the upshots. For researchers and institutions that oversee them, well, just be aware of these definitions and guidelines, so you know that when you have research activities that are research, that you make sure you go through the right regulatory approvals, that you apply the right protections. you do the right thing, but also conversely, to avoid being overly cautious. Because if you just say defensively, okay, everything I'm doing counts as research, you undergo a lot of bureaucratic rigmarole that really isn't necessary given the risks that you're involved with and given the regulations that you're subject to. So that's something to keep in mind. Though also to keep in mind, if something is classified as non-research, doesn't mean, oh, you can do whatever you want. Other standards apply. I didn't talk today in this presentation about clinical standards. I think Jerry will talk more about standards of clinical practice, for example, that will still absolutely apply, even if it's not research. Not that, oh, anything goes. It's just the particular research regulations and research requirements would not apply in that case. And a different set of standards might take precedence, including best interest of patients. And then for IRBs, many of you are involved in IRBs as members of the Secretariat. One avenue is, to advise researchers, educate researchers a bit about this. Researchers might query, is this, do I need to submit this for IRB review or not? And, if you're going to decide this is not a research study, then you can confidently say, yeah, no need, or vice versa, say that, yes, you do need to send it in. Another aspect, which isn't actually related maybe to the overall question of whether or not a whole, activity is research, but within a study, what is a research activity is very crucial, right? So what interventions, what tests are being done for research purposes versus non-research purposes? This is crucial because what is being done for research constitutes the risks and benefits of the study, right? What would be done anyway? So any tests or procedures that would be done as part of routine clinical care or even routine clinical audit, that is not a risk or that cannot constitute the risks or benefits of research. The risks and benefits of research are constituted by those additional things you're doing that you wouldn't otherwise do, but you're doing because you need to generate this knowledge or other things that arise from the research context. And that's how then you do the risk-benefit assessment of the research study per se, based on those research activities. Similarly, the consent form, when you're signing the consent form, that's consenting to the research activities is the primary purpose of that process. Okay, penultimate slide here, just a few further resources. Human Biomedical Research Act, Health Products Regulations, BAC guidelines, and MOH guidance. And I'll leave that for people to look at later. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing now and turn it over to Jerry. We'll have time for Q&A and discussion after Jerry's talk. Jerry, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Owen. Let's see if I could share. Okay, let's say I have to launch that. So get it in the screen. Okay. Thanks, Owen. Thanks for the generous introduction, and thanks for that overview of all these detailed rules dividing research from non-research. And again, welcome everybody. It's great to have so many people here. So what I want to do is build on Owen's introduction to this broad field, and as he indicated, drill down on one particular topic. And what we're going to talk about is the category of non-standard care in the clinical setting, basically a clinician providing somebody with non-standard care. And what I want to talk about is, I guess I would call it the flexibility that's built into the system that people, including both researchers and IRBs, people who work for IRBs, don't often recognize how much flexibility there is. And this is a category, I think, that non-standard care doesn't get enough attention. And the way I'm going to talk about it is to actually try to build into my analysis an overview of why we have rules about protecting research subjects. So I think the analysis is relevant to even those of you who don't deal with, just clinical trials and that sort of thing. So that's the game plan. I think this is actually, even just looking at this category on its own, is important. I started thinking about this and writing about it like around more than 15 years ago. And this category actually played a major role and became a sort of pretty controversial category during the pandemic. There was a lot of issues about, discovering new treatments for COVID-19 and that sort of thing. So it's actually grown in importance. So let me get going. And I believe in sort of, interesting stories. I think it helps us to, understand things, remember things better. So a lot of what I'm going to tell you first is about this sort of interesting story. And what I'm going to talk about is, how do we do what we'd call a full thickness corneal transplant, and how might we think about improving that procedure. So let's go onward here. Okay, so what I have a little picture here. It's about a little device called a tree fine, and tree fines are just devices for cutting things. And in particular, this little device, and that's sort of about the size of like a thimble, that little metal part that you could see there. And it's used for actually cutting a part of the cornea, what we'll call a corneal button, out of a deceased person's eye. That would be the donor. We're going to take that donor cornea and put it in somebody who needs a new cornea. And this is showing what a remarkable thing this is. On the left side, you see a person who has corneal edema. They have a bad cornea. We can go into another time the reasons why this might happen, but there are a lot of reasons. And that person would not see well at all. They'd effectively be functionally blind in that eye. You can see how cloudy it is. And on the right side, that's after a corneal transplant. And that's a very, a good cornea, transparent, has the right shape for, refracting light, that sort of thing. And you'll notice there are a bunch of sutures there. If you could see those little lines, the black lines are sutures. So what happens in the corneal transplant is that this little corneal button is, a cut is made in the recipient's, the patient's eye, and the corneal button is plopped into that hole, and then it's sewn in place. So what have I sort of just told you about? Basically what I would call standard care. And standard care plays a huge role in our current system. Really important to know whether something is standard care. In general, in most cases, it's the profession blessing ways to do something. There may be more than one way to do standard care for a particular type of medical problem. But again, really important role. And a lot of what I'm telling you is a blending of law and ethics. It's probably more law than ethics, but again, I think they overlap, as I certainly agree with Owen on that point. So now let me tell you more about our case here. So in the late 1990s, there was an ophthalmologist, let's call him Dr. R, and he proposed a method to improve basically corneal transplant. The fancy name is penetrating keratoplasty. And what he wanted to do was reduce the time and improve the results. And remember, I told you you had to put all those sutures in there, and there were a whole bunch of them you saw in the picture. Well, if you didn't have to do that, it would be sort of a lot quicker to do the procedure. So let me go back. Sorry. Let me just get rid of this showing up here. Okay, so he came up with a sutureless corneal transplant technique. He actually got a patent on it. This is back in 1996. Again, doing corneal transplants, and his goal was to have fewer complications than previous methods. And this is actually, an illustration that you had to create, I guess, for getting the patent. And if you look at the sort of that floating thing on the top, that's the donor's cornea after you've cut out the piece of it. And remember, I was talking about the tree fine. He actually got this like nuclear engineer type person to design a new type of tree fine. And basically, if you see what's happening here, the difference, the new part here, are these little kind of tabs, the 4 tabs that are shown here. And what would happen, his goal was that you would have the tree fine cut out this button with the 4 tabs, and then you'd use, a little scalpel in the recipient's eyeball to make these little slits here, the 4 little slits, and then you'd plop the button into the big hole and then put the little tabs into the slits. It reminds me a lot of if like, kids these days still play with paper dolls, kind of like inserting the paper doll to close on the paper doll, that kind of thing. Okay, so what did he do? He studied this in cats, he began using it in people, and he never got IRB review of this, okay, for whatever reason. So now we're a few years ahead. This is in 2001. US Today is a pretty major newspaper in the US. And this is the story it wrote about this, that in 1994, this eye surgeon invented this medical device that he thought would revolutionize corneal transplant surgery, make him millions of dollars. It didn't do any of that, and it cost him a high-paying university job and led to federal findings that he performed unapproved research on more than 60 people, including children. Obviously, that's pretty bad if you're a Dr. R, okay? And it was the US Office for Human Research Protections, OHRP, that investigated this and made those findings. And in fact, it concluded that he had proposed a randomized controlled trial. He didn't conduct it, okay, but he had proposed it, and he used an untested technique in 60 people, presented abstracts of the results at meetings. And remember everything Owen told you about all these criteria you could use to figure out is something research or not research. And OHRP concluded, looking at all those facts that they just laid out, yes, he was doing research. This constituted, same definition Owen was talking about, systematic collection of stuff, okay? And it was for purposes of producing generalizable knowledge, like a better way to do a corneal transplant, okay? So the bottom line is this was research. It would have needed IRB review. He didn't get it. That was bad. He violated the rules, and they forced his institution to send letters to all of the patients saying that they'd been research subjects and been exposed to experimental surgery. Not the circumstance you want to be in, okay? So let's go to the big picture. The main goal here is my not telling you about this particular instance, but tell you broader issues about how should we think about why we have rules relating to research, clinical or not, but in this case, I'm using the examples of clinical. And the way I want you to think about it is you often hear a lot about standard care, and then you often hear a lot about the research side, as Owen indicated, how do we figure out if something's in category 1 or category 3? And I want to concentrate here on category 2, this middle category, which is that of, on the clinical side, in the non-research setting, providing somebody with some kind of treatment that is not standard care. And again, I think this is a under-evaluated category, but as we saw in the pandemic, a really, really important category. Massive amounts of stuff actually fall into this category. In the US, there are billions of treatments, whatever, that are given each year that aren't standard care. Okay, so let me explain why I'm going this direction. Dr. R actually had a defense that he wasn't doing research. And he said the technique, was never used on his patients as part of any systematic investigation. And I'm just quoting the definition of research, which is exactly the same as the one that Owen discussed. And I'm just noting it is the same as the Singapore, okay, definition. So key question to always ask if you want trying to figure out is something research or is it not research, what activities, if any, is the physician conducting that are not fully justified by the goal of doing what is best for the patient? What things are they doing for the purpose of learning how best to treat future patients? Again, just implementing the rules that Owen talked about. And again, I'm concentrating on this third middle category, namely not being in the research setting, not doing research, but providing non-standard care. And I think we could learn a lot in terms of how we could think about our rules for protecting research subjects. And so what I want you to think about is when this all happened, there was a lot of effort to conclude that Dr. R was doing research. And a lot of these people going in that direction thought that if he wasn't found to be doing research, then there weren't any restrictions on his ability to do whatever he was doing, that this is some sort of hole in the system. And so I'd like to explore that, and I want you to think about that. Suppose he did fewer research-like things, kept no research records, analyzed no data, didn't submit abstracts, and suppose he told his patients, look, this is a new experimental technique, but he thought it was the best clinical option for them. So in other words, let's assume he did a better job of trying to shoehorn what he was doing into the non-research side of things by not doing research-like stuff. And so the question is, assuming he did that and was successful in putting himself into that category 2, providing non-standard care, what rules would have applied to him? Would he have been better off? And so was his main problem that he was just careless and did too many research-like things? And to explain that, I want to raise an argument that prominently was in the New England Journal about almost 25 years ago by Robert Trug, a really, really well-known, very talented, smart bioethicist, world-renowned. And he talked about a paradox that a lot of people have been talking about for decades. And I'm just paraphrasing what he wrote. It's a great article to read if you ever want to look into this more. So a physician reads about a new treatment and he could begin using on his patients merely by getting their general consent. Like he doesn't have to write a special complicated consent form, pages and pages, just for giving this technique to them. And True contrasted this with a physician who wants to do research on that treatment to see if it actually is effective or has appropriate risks, such as a randomized trial comparing two antibiotics for bronchitis. And that physician, who we think is actually doing a much more important thing, trying to learn to teach all of us what's correct. That person has to prepare a formal protocol, obtain approval for an IRB, seek written informed consent from the potential participants, write up this consent form. And bottom line, as True puts it, physician can do almost anything they want in terms of therapeutic innovation, but only if there's no attempt to gain systematic knowledge from the intervention, which sounds like backwards. Or I need permission to give a new drug to half my patients, but not to give it to all of them. Now, if you buy all that, that sounds like, wow, this system is really bad. Why is it doing all of this? And so we might ask, is Trug right that physicians can do most anything they want in the name of therapeutic innovation, so long as they don't try to learn from it, i.e., these are stupid rules that are discouraging people from actually conducting good research because they don't want to go through IRB review, et cetera. And my answer is many no's. This is just wrong. And I want to explain why I think that is the answer here. And to understand this, you have to understand the ethical and legal rules relating to that middle category. That's what I keep coming back to. Non-standard care in the clinical setting, not being research. What are the rules that apply to it? So let's go into that. So if you're giving standard care to a patient, the patient is number one. I'm just talking about the general medical and ethical rules. This goes back to the Hippocratic Oath thousands of years ago, that the doctor is supposed to do everything other than, again, a few exceptions, to benefit the patient. Okay, very clear. Doctors are trained this way or all around the world in terms of core medical ethics. And bottom line, non-standard care, that middle category I'm talking about, not in research. So it's subject to exactly the same rules. You're still providing clinical care to a patient. The patient still has to be number one. The doctor has to be thinking about what is in the best interest of the patient. Now, I haven't said anything about research yet, okay? What happens if the doctor is in like the standard care scenario or the non-standard care scenario, but providing clinical care? If you don't follow the patient is number one rule, you're committing malpractice. It's unethical, it's legally wrong, a lot of bad things happen. I just give you some facts here. You can Google it later on a case that happened in the US. It doesn't matter even if the patient gave consent. Patients do not have the right to consent to kind of bad things happening to them. Okay, so this is our background on the clinical side. And what's the rule for determining when you can provide non-standard care? And the bottom line is you ask, is whatever you're doing in the best interest of the patient, okay? Is it reasonable for this patient and their well-being for you as a doctor to depart from standard care? And basically it'd be balancing, IRBs are still certainly familiar with balancing things, comparing the risk and benefits to this particular patient of the departure from standard care. So that's how you would figure all this out, again, on the clinical side. No research yet, okay? So now let's bring in the world of research. And I'm telling you something that anybody in the world of IRBs should know really, really well. On standard care side, patient's number one. On non-standard care side, again, still Hippocratic Oath, patient is number one. In research, patient is not number one anymore. You're doing something to produce generalizable knowledge, okay? And it's serving a different goal. And if you want to actually have a really blatant example, I'm sure people are familiar with, look at the COVID-19 challenge trials. So we have a recent example, okay? So viewed correctly, the rules regarding how to conduct research, I think, should be viewed as empowering physicians. Okay, because often, again, you have people like Bob Trug saying, well, these are really, really bad rules that, they force us to go through all these hoops that we'd rather not go through. And that's not correct. They're actually authorizing the physician as a researcher to do things that they couldn't otherwise do. In fact, again, the rules allowing research allow physicians and other healthcare providers to violate the patient's number one rule you'd be under if you're performing non-standard care and being purely on the clinical side as opposed to the research side. And the trade-off for being allowed to do that is complying with all these requirements. IRB review, special informed consent, written consent forms, that kind of stuff, which requirements make sure that removing the patient as number one rule doesn't inappropriately harm the subjects. So note, this way of thinking about it is a very, very different conclusion from True, who say that research rules are instead an inappropriate administrative barrier. When Trug says that he could give an unproven treatment to all of his patients, but not half, he ignores the fact that if he wants to do that, he's going to have to comply with the patient's number one rule. But by going through the research route, he's actually no longer under that rule. He's under a much more liberal regime that lets him do a whole bunch of things that are no longer in the interest of that patient. Okay. So what activities indicate you're doing research? Again, Owen went through this in a lot more detail than I'm doing in this slide, just giving you some of the highlighted ones. If you're doing randomization, if you're doing standardization, performing additional tests or procedures to answer the research question, not disclosing interim results. Again, all of these are things that would lean to concluding that you're on the research side. So again, we're back to kind of Dr. R, or any doctor out there. They can often, by figuring out what they're actually doing, what they do actually do, control in the non-standard care setting, put themselves on the non-research side of things. And because being under the research category frees the physician from complying with the patient as number one rule, namely doing everything in the best interest of the patient, it will in fact often be in a physician's best interest to intentionally put themselves in the research category. So again, very different than the way Trug was thinking of it. The physician researcher will want to be on the research side. It benefits them legally, okay, and not on the providing non-standard care in the non-research setting category. Now, just flesh this out a little bit because there are a lot of considerations here, but my emphasis in general about all this is note the flexibility in the system. It's for the physician to decide which category they want to be in, and often they actually can control that. Now, if you are going the non-standard care, clinical, not being in research route, note you may face greater litigation risk, not on the first or second patient, but on later patients, because you're reaffirming that you're not doing research, not systematically trying to learn from your prior cases. But this very fact might be a good argument that you're not following the patient's number one rule for the later patients. You failed to appropriately learn from your prior experience how perhaps you should have modified what you're doing on this later patient. Now, this concern would be minimized for physicians who only provide non-standard care for a relatively small number of patients. And it might be relevant, particularly in Singapore, that there actually is a lot less litigation than in the US. So there might be greater incentives for many physicians to go the non-standard care route, because they're probably not likely to be sued. And I just want to give you an example of an aggressive use of successfully going down the non-standard care route. As of 2005, I'm talking about treating something called age-related macular degeneration, or AMD. Company Genentech was studying a new drug called Lucentis as treatment for that. Lucentis happened to be a fragment of an antibody, and the full-sized antibody was already given as a drug that Genentech also, was already on the market, called Avastin. And as more and more evidence was coming out there that it sounded like Lucentis was going to get approval, clinicians in 2005 at the University of Miami, which was the top, and I think still is, the top ophthalmology department, a place called Bascom Palmer in the US. They began using Avastin off-label on numerous AMD patients in largely identical manner. And they were very clear they were going to, in the future, do chart review, but they didn't say they were going to do it now. They put it off. And somebody sent a letter of complaint to that US regulatory agency, OHRP, saying this was unapproved research. And OHRP ultimately concluded that those allegations were not substantiated, that it couldn't be proven that they actually were doing research. So they basically said, okay, this stuff, we have to accept at the moment that it should be viewed as on the clinical side, non-standard care. And there's a really good article by one of the co-PIs that you could look up later on or something. Okay, just want to give you 2 quotes on these slides, categories of in the Singapore regulations. This is from the Singapore Medical Council Handbook. It talks about untested medical practices, and at the bottom says treatments that are generally not generally accepted may be offered to patients only in the context of formal and approved clinical trials. That almost sounds as if, well, you're not going to be able to have this middle category of non-standard care on the clinical side. And there's a sort of related discussion in that document about innovative therapy. But the bottom line is, if you talk to medical legal experts in Singapore, which I have, and they basically said, when you fully correctly interpret these 2 sets of rules, it's not changing the rules any differently than most other countries, including the US, that there is a robust category of non-standard care provided outside of research in Singapore. And the test is actually similar to the test I already told you in the US. Are you doing something reasonably in terms of what kind of treatment you're providing? Now, I mentioned, I discussed all this stuff in a lot of depth, a lot more than I've given you here in a book I wrote about 15 years ago, What the Doctor Didn't Say. So you can take that out of your friendly local library. And I think that covers what I wanted to say. There's my email. Happy to talk about this stuff. And feel free to tell us, things, you may want us to cover more about any of this or other things in future webinars or future talks or whatever it is. So I am going to stop sharing. And hand it over to Owen to deal with questions, comments, whatever.
Great, thanks very much, Jerry, for that. A lot of interesting details there, and looking particularly at the clinical context, very relevant for a lot of clinical research. So we have a few minutes left before the end of the session, so now time for a Q&A from the audience, and anything related to Jerry and I talked about, or generally questions about definitions and categorizations of research and non-research activities. So again, you can either use the chat to type in your questions, or if you want, you can raise your hand and ask them verbally. So people now want to type your questions or chat, or use your video.
And I see Paul Tambaya's comment about similar cases in Singapore.
Yes, he sent a link there. Check what that it's about. Okay, so this is the Panasan case. I don't know, Paul, did you want to share a bit about this case for people, or?
Yeah, my microphone's not working so well. I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Very well.
Okay, great. Yeah, so this case was a guy who had developed a new device, feeding tube, and I think it had been used occasionally elsewhere, and he used it on a few patients, and he tried to write it up, but basically the medical council was unhappy about it because they felt that this was an unapproved procedure, and so but he has had an endless battle with them, and it's just he used to send emails to everybody in Singapore, and it was just a very unpleasant kind of situation. But I think the idea of introducing new technologies in medicine, especially in the private sector, because he was in private practice, is a huge gray area. And actually related to that is the second question I put in the chat, which was in Singapore, a lot of patients who have failed chemotherapy for cancer they have failed second-line or third-line chemotherapy, they're encouraged to enroll in phase 1 clinical trials of novel treatments. And in this setting, it's a super gray area, because they're told you've exhausted all the drugs that are available. There is this new drug, it's not yet licensed, it's in a phase 1 trial, would you like to try it? And the weird thing is, the drug is provided for free. The biomarker testing is done for free, but everything else the patient has to pay for. So that's an area which, again, I don't know if there are any oncologists in this group, but I think that's something which has always kind of troubled me over.
So in particular, no, great example. So in particular, the payment issue is that, because in terms of it being research at that point, I mean, again, if it's an unapproved drug, you wouldn't have the issue. You don't even have an off-label use option, right? So clearly they're going to have to, right, the physician's going to have to go through whatever route, regulatory route, to put this under the research setting. As you know, Paul, there's a huge incentive on the part of the patients to want that. They don't have a lot of other options then, but I don't think that's considered right unethical. I mean, that's the way our systems kind of work.
Yeah, just to note one clarification point. In Singapore, you're not allowed to charge participants to participate in a trial. So the payments that Paul is referring to are, I presume, going to be sort of tests and procedures that are sort of considered standard of care.
That's right.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So they'll pay for the standard of care, but then things that are done for research, the biomarkers test, the experimental drug, that's what is, yes, that's the difference. Whereas in other contexts, you might have fully paid for. I think of the NIH Clinical Center, there's some fully paid for things, but it's not fully paid for in this context, as Paul was saying. Yeah. And just another, I mean, a note on that, yeah, I mean, the idea of getting, I mean, there's a long history, of course, I mean, Jerry is very aware in the US of making use of clinical trials for access purposes. The HIV epidemic, this was, very commonly used as trials used as a mechanism for distributing ARV, antiretrovirals before they were widely available. More recently in COVID-19, remember there was a remdesivir trial. Singapore had an arm where they had expanded numbers for primarily just to increase access before it was went to mass market. So yeah, there is this history of that. I mean, I think that goes against sort of the spirit of the clinical trial, because you're trying to make use of this kind of regulatory apparatus for the purpose of distribution, and that's something to be cautious of. And that's not really in line with the spirit of the regulations and the kind of the mechanisms and the reason why we have these systems in place is again for knowledge generation rather than for distribution. That having been said, from the patient perspective, yeah, it's totally rational. If you have, patients are not necessarily interested in generating knowledge. There's no obligation, even if the purpose of the study is generating knowledge, patients don't have to be motivated by that at all. Patients can be motivated by, the desire to get a treatment. They might feel that this is their only option. And the study is going to go forward because it generates valuable knowledge. That's essential. But the patients might have, a view of hope that is motivating them. The only one of the concerns there is just about the therapeutic misconception. You want to make sure that patients in that circumstance don't overvalue the chances of the drug working, right? And so, I mean, Jerry, you talked before about, what do patients have an appreciation that vast majority of these trials fail, especially you mentioned kind of phase 1 trials, majority of them fail. So, it might be a question of, do they have excess hope and are they consenting when they think this is definitely going to benefit them when in fact odds are it won't? Or whether they rationally think, yeah, maybe odds are it won't work, but better than nothing.
Yeah, which, as you noted, we could have further seminars, whatever it is, on informed consent issues, because actually there are, some of us think there are problems with what we do in terms of informed consent now on phase 1 trials and other trials. And again, a lot of us think it's actually not that hard to give people more appropriate information that would make it clear to them. You say in huge print, with a big box around it on the front page of your consent form, your chance of benefiting from being in this particular clinical trial is very, very close to zero. And the evidence out there is that people will understand that, but we often are not that clear. We give them vague, you may or may not benefit, which is like most people say 50-50. Great topic. Great.
Thanks. Maybe it's something we should return to, in a future webinar or future event. Any other questions or comments before we close? It looks like we just are at the hour, actually, just
Yeah.
at 1 o'clock. So thanks everyone for your participation. And just as a reminder, right, there is another 2 weeks from now, we have another session. Julian Savulescu and Jerry Menikoff will be speaking on risks in research and different nuances and controversies in that area. So if you haven't registered already, please do go ahead and do so. Same time and format, also free. Again, same thing, CMA points, CP points pending. Yeah, so we look forward to hopefully seeing you at those future events. And you can see also the other 2 sessions in the series. The third session is going to be on, I'll give a talk on scientific validity, and then the last session will be on inducement, payments, and coercion. Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a good rest of the day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.